All right, today we're jumping into the core ideas of a pretty provocative book from 2002, Paul Gottfried's Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt. Now, Gottfried lays out this huge theory about how the entire purpose of the modern Western state has, well, completely changed. So let's break down his key arguments.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with Gottfried's idea of a new kind of state. Then we'll get into how he thinks socialism didn't actually die, but just changed its shape. After that, we'll dig into what he calls the politics of guilt, trace its really controversial roots, and wrap it all up with his big final conclusion, the idea of a secular theocracy.
So, first up, Gottfried's main point is that the modern state has basically switched jobs. It's not so much about economics anymore, it's about something else entirely.
And this is really the fundamental question his whole theory is built on. You know, we used to think about government overreach in terms of things like taxes or the state taking over industries. But Gottfried argues that there's a new and maybe even more powerful kind of control that's emerged, one that's all about managing how we think, how we feel, and how we act.
He's got a name for this new thing, the therapeutic state. The idea here is that its main goal isn't really economic security anymore, it's social healing. The state kind of sets itself up as society's therapist, Its job is to re-educate all of us, correct our wrong think, and treat any moral disagreement as a kind of sickness that needs to be cured by the government.
This chart really lays out the difference super clearly. The old-school welfare state, it used economic tools, entitlements, government programs to move wealth around. But the therapeutic state, it uses things like anti-discrimination laws, public education campaigns, and sensitivity training. The goal isn't just about your bank account. It's about completely rebuilding the social conscience of the country.
And check this out. A 1995 case in Germany is a perfect example of what he's talking about. The country's top court ordered crucifixes to be taken out of classrooms in Bavaria, even though the area is overwhelmingly Catholic. The court's president actually defended the ruling with this quote, saying, "Justice shouldn't just be about what the majority wants." For Gottfried, this is the therapeutic state, in action, stepping in, going against what the public wants to enforce a new kind of social value.
Okay, let's move to the next piece of the puzzle. Gottfried argues that when the Soviet Union fell, socialism didn't just pack up and go home. Nope, he says it evolved.
He lays out this really sharp contrast. The old left, he says, was all about economic control, taking over industries, redistributing income, that kind of thing. It was the world of union bosses. But he says the post-communist left shifted its attention almost completely to behavioral control. The new fight is over things like multicultural education, hate speech laws, and expanding rights for certain minority groups. The goal is no longer about taking over the economy, it's about re-engineering the culture.
So, in Gottfried's view, that core desire for a huge, state-led transformation of society, it never really went away. It just found a new way to operate. Instead of seizing the factories, the goal now is to reshape how we all think and feel.
Which brings us to a really important question. What's the engine that powers this whole system? Where does this therapeutic state get its moral authority to get so involved in everyone's lives?
He calls it the politics of guilt. The idea is that Western societies are fundamentally defined by their past sins, racism, sexism, you name it. And because of this unsubdued past, as he calls it, we need a state that is always on guard. So government intervention isn't just a one-time thing, it's a never-ending process of making up for past wrongs to make sure society doesn't slide back into its old bad ways. And that, he says, is the justification for constant social engineering. Now, to see how this works in practice, Gottfried points to a series of laws in Britain. Just look at the progression here. It starts in 1965, making discriminatory publications a crime. A few years later, it gets stronger. But for Gottfried, the real game changer was the 1976 Act. It banned communications that simply revealed ethnic prejudice, whether you intended to cause trouble or not. A major legal figure at the time, Lord Hailsham, had this pretty powerful criticism. He said the law basically removed the mental element, the intent to cause harm, which is a huge deal in English common law. In Gottfried's view, this is the therapeutic state flexing its muscles. The crime isn't what you do anymore, it's simply having and expressing the wrong state of mind.
And the real-world consequences of this stuff can be pretty intense. Gottfried mentions that around the time he was writing, about 8,000 people a year in Germany, a lot of them journalists and academics, were put on trial for a crime that translates to inciting the public, which often meant just expressing opinions that the state considered unacceptable.
Okay, this next section is where Gottfried's argument gets its most abstract and honestly its most controversial. He starts asking why. Why did this therapeutic state, fueled by guilt, pop up specifically in these Western post-Protestant countries? He bases a lot of this on a theory from another scholar, James Kurth, called the Protestant deformation. The argument is basically that the political culture we've been talking about isn't brand new. It's actually a secular version, like a non-religious echo, of some really deep-seated religious ideas that are especially strong in Protestant cultures. I know it sounds a little dense, but let's break it down. Kurth's theory, as Gottfried presents it, is like a cultural evolution. Step 1. It starts with this religious focus on the individual's inner state, having a pure heart, individual salvation. Step 2. This then leads to social traits that are kind of suspicious of hierarchy and strong community traditions. Step 3. Over time, this all becomes secularized, turning into a cultural obsession with individual expression and authenticity. And the final step? It becomes a political mission, a state-run project to create a mind that is cleansed of pathological thoughts like prejudice. This quote from Kurth is really the key to the whole argument. The idea is that this specific cultural DNA, with its intense focus on the individual conscience and its distrust of traditional authority, created the perfect environment for a political ideology that also puts the inner state of the individual above the customs of the community.
So, how does Gottfried tie all of this together? All these different threads? Well, he uses one really powerful and provocative term to describe the whole system.
And this is his final thesis. He argues that when a government, backed up by the media and academia, stops managing the economy and starts managing morality, using the power of the state to enforce a specific moral code, it starts to look a lot like a theocracy. Just, one without a god in the traditional sense. So, just to sum up the features that lead him to use that term, the state acts as the moral healer. Things like sensitivity and caring become these dogmas you can't challenge. Public apologies for historical sins become a required civic duty. The government administrators and social experts who run all this, they become a new kind of priesthood. And maybe most importantly, disagreeing isn't just a political difference of opinion anymore. It's treated like heresy.
And that really brings us to the big final question. Gottfried wrote all of this over 2 decades ago. When you look at the world around you right now, does this idea of a therapeutic state that's driven by a politics of guilt, does it resonate? Does it help explain our political and cultural world today? And that's the thought we're going to leave you with.